Almost every day I receive messages from people asking about how they can prove their Sephardic ancestry. So I've just made a short introduction. If you have more detailed questions, then drop me an email and my details will be below. So most people are asking this because of the Portuguese and Spanish nationality laws. Whilst the recent Spanish offer for citizenship for people of Sephardic descent has closed, there are other options, although applying to Portugal is simpler, considerably simpler. So I think the first thing we have to say is that the word Sephardic has different meanings to different people, and let's just quickly run through what these are, and specifically then look at what counts for the Spanish and Portuguese governments. The first and most obvious is that Sefardi in Hebrew means the Iberian Peninsula. In modern Hebrew, it just means Spain. And so in that meaning, a Sephardic Jew is somebody with ancestry from the Iberian Peninsula. A second usage is the people who follow the Iberian Sephardic prayer book, and this includes most Jewish communities from around the Mediterranean, especially so Arabic-speaking communities who were never in the Iberian Peninsula. And the third usage is, especially in Israel, Sephardic means anybody who is not Ashkenazi, anybody whose family origins are not in Germany or Eastern Europe. And so what do these governments mean by Sephardic? Well, fairly obviously, they're talking about people with ancestry in the Iberian Peninsula. So unfortunately, if you identify as Sephardic, and indeed in many respects are Sephardic, but your family origins are perhaps in Iraq or Iran or some other place, and your ancestors were never in Spain or Portugal, unfortunately, you do not qualify under the law. So more definitions, and I'm afraid it is a complicated subject. So let's ask ourselves, who are the Iberian Sephardim? And I think we can simplify, and I am going to massively simplify because this is just a very short discussion. We can simplify into three groups. First of all, we have the Megorashim, mostly in North Africa, the Eastern Sephardim, principally in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Western Sephardim living around the Atlantic seaboard. So the Megorashim, and this means exiles in Hebrew, are largely descended from Jews who fled the Iberian Peninsula before 1492, because obviously there were persecutions before then, and then of course later reinforced by other communities. And these especially settled in northern Morocco. I mean, we think of towns like Tangier and Tetuan, but other places in Morocco, and spread down the coast of Algeria as well. And of course, like all Sephardim, like all Jews, they're highly mobile, and so Moroccan Jews later settled in Gibraltar, in England. There is a community in the Amazon in northern Brazil, went to Egypt. I mean, Jews are mobile, but this, especially northern Morocco, but the coasts of Morocco and Algeria is where that community was centered. Secondly, the Eastern Sephardim, and these are normally the Sephardim people are aware of. These are the Jews that were living in the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, and that's now countries like Turkey, Greece, parts of Syria and Lebanon, Southeastern Europe, sort of Macedonia, Bosnia, Bulgaria, parts of Romania, and so forth. And this community spoke a language they called Spanish, also Judeo-Spanish, commonly called Ladino. And again, many people from this community migrated to other places. Seattle in the United States today has famously got an Eastern Sephardic community. And finally, the Western Sephardim, that's what I am, also known as Spanish and Portuguese Jews or Portuguese Jews. And these are the communities historically in places like London and Amsterdam, Bordeaux, Hamburg, Livorno in northern Italy, and then, you know, in other places as well, in Jamaica and New York and around the English-speaking world especially, and of course Curacao, the Dutch colony in the Caribbean. This is a sort of stereotypical picture we have of migrations of Jews arriving at Ellis Island in New York. But just to reinforce the point of how mobile our families were, this is a picture of a very elegant Jewish-owned department store in Cairo in the early 20th century. And a lot of Jews, mostly Sephardim, migrated to Egypt after the opening of the Suez Canal, where there were lots of opportunities there. And although people came from all over, they formed a unified community. And this is one of the problems we sometimes have with Sephardic genealogy, that you can have somebody living in a mixed community who may or may not have Iberian origins. This is also a particular problem in Morocco, where some people were never in the Iberian Peninsula, others were, but they could have the same Arabic or even Berber surnames. So how do we prove it? The honest and place to start is with yourself. Genealogy always starts with yourself. And let's just take your birth certificate. This is primary evidence. This is evidence actually about you. And certainly for an application for citizenship, try to focus on primary documents. They're not very interested in seeing family photos or other stuff. So your birth certificate is going to give your full name, your date of birth, your place of birth, your father's name. In some countries, both parents are given. And of course, then with this, you have evidence that you are somebody's child. And remember, we are only tracing the Sephardic parents' line. So if it's your father, you would trace your father's certificates. If it was your mother, you would trace her certificates. And it is just a matter of painstakingly going back document by document, generation by generation. And you know, it's very easy just to jump on the internet, find a family tree which goes back to, you know, some alleged ancestor in Spain in 1492, or in some cases King David or the Garden of Eden. Family trees, online family trees, these are not a shortcut, because often for Sephardic families they contain errors and they don't contain evidence. I mean, some of these family trees, well, let me define that. Some of these family trees are very, very carefully researched by, you know, rigorous people who know what they're doing, and others are just thrown together by people who perhaps have more enthusiasm than knowledge. So if a family tree has the evidential sources, then carefully review that. Otherwise, be very, very careful. And the same thing on Google. Google's a black hole. You can just disappear down. You can find somebody of, you know, an interesting name, but, you know, lots of cousins will all have the same name, and unrelated people as well. So that can be very difficult too. What I mean by unevidenced speculation is that so many families have traditions of various sorts. Lots of Ashkenazi families have traditions of Sephardic origin which may have emerged in the 19th century. There doesn't seem to be very much archival evidence of Sephardim, of Ashkenazim, of Sephardic ancestry, and indeed same with DNA. Although it has to be said, there is some. DNA, okay, so there are different sorts of DNA. Most of us, when we think of DNA, we think of the autosomal tests. These are the family finder tests, which we can all take. And these can be fun because it suddenly shows us lots of distant relatives. But if you just think about how it works, you will be receiving and I'm simplifying again, half of your DNA from your father and half of your mother, and then 25% from each grandparent, and on average 12.5% from each great-grandparent. And once you've gone back a few more generations, you can see how, on average, small the segment you receive from each of those distant ancestors. And so if you're trying to work out where your ancestors lived in say 1492, autosomal DNA is not going to help you. It might identify, you know, third, fourth, fifth, perhaps even sixth cousins, but it's not, I'm afraid, going to do much more. Other forms of DNA test are mitochondrial DNA. This is the DNA that a mother passes down to her children. Unfortunately, with mitochondrial DNA, genealogy is very much, I'm afraid, the history of men, so that women's lines are less well documented, so it can be quite difficult to trace back. And also the mitochondrial DNA mutates at a much slower rate than the Y-DNA we'll discuss in a minute. And that means you're going to have a very, very large number of matches which may not be useful. And the third sort, as we just mentioned, is the Y-DNA. This is passed down from father to son. And this is quite interesting. And of course, if you're a woman, you won't have the Y-DNA, but your brother or your father or your paternal uncle or a male cousin on the paternal side will. And you know, if you don't have any close male relatives, you can go up a couple of generations and then down again to find a more distant cousin. Y-DNA mutates at a faster rate, and it's often possible to more or less work out where different branches have separated. And also the Avatenu DNA project is collecting Y-DNA samples from men of known Sephardic lineage. I've actually contributed. And so that means that if you think that you may have a match and you know you have a surname that you think is connected, then perhaps your data can be compared against what's on the Avatenu database, and maybe there'll be a match. So finally, where not to start, I would say, with a law firm. And I have to say that there are a lot of excellent law firms out there, and there are some that are not so excellent. If you're applying for Portugal, you don't need a lawyer anyway, irrespective of what some lawyers might tell you. For Spain, it is more complicated, and perhaps a lawyer is a good idea. If you are hiring a lawyer and you don't already have one, then the law society in your country may be able to provide you with a list, or your embassy in Madrid probably has a list of local lawyers they know. Obviously, you do not go with a law firm that is just advertising on Google or whatever without doing very careful research first. As I say, there are excellent law firms out there, but there are also a lot of horror stories and people who have been significantly overcharged. So how far back do I need to trace? Let's assume that this is an ethical piece of research, because unfortunately there are no properly set rules by the Spanish or the Portuguese authorities. And generally amongst those of us who are seriously looking at the subject, we've come to a date of 1850 for Megorashim, that's people from Morocco, parts of Algeria, or Eastern Sephardim from the Ottoman Empire. And for Western Sephardim, that's Amsterdam, London, and so forth, 1750. The reason for the difference is that Eastern Sephardim and Megorashim remained endogamous for much longer. And what that means is that they married within their community. And of course, there were other Jewish communities living around them. There were, say, Romaniot Jews in places like Greece. There were Mustarabim, Arabic-speaking Jews in North Africa and the Middle East, Berber-speaking Jews, and various other communities. If you can trace back to 1850 for Megorashim or Eastern Sephardic, then I think we can say fairly solidly that that is a Sephardic family. And 1750 for Western Sephardim. And remember, it is much, much easier to trace for Western Sephardim, because in countries like England and the Netherlands, most of the records remain intact. But what do you do if records are missing? And this can be quite common, so that Thessaloniki in northern Greece had a terrible fire shortly after the Greeks conquered the city, and that destroyed most of the Jewish archives. A similar tragedy happened in Smyrna in Izmir. Jewish communities got expelled from most Arab countries at quite short notice in the 1940s, 1950s. Lots of documents were lost. In Egypt, many of the Jewish community documents are now under lock and key in the National Archives. Some people speculate this is because the Egyptian government is concerned that Jews might sue them for expropriated property, but it is a challenge, and I'm afraid what you need to do in those circumstances is this is perhaps when you do start to go to secondary sources. So perhaps you can start to look at newspapers, documents that still might exist within the family, letters and so forth, commercial directories, perhaps legal records and so forth. And very often it is possible to identify who qualifies, and a reasonable congregation like for example, the S&P Sephardi Community of London, and I declare an interest that I help them out there, will do a review. And interestingly enough, this is the approach that was taken with people who are fleeing from the Inquisition, that very often somebody would arrive in Amsterdam in the clothes that they were wearing. They would go to the synagogue, and then somebody else would say, well, I knew this person because I was in the Inquisition prison with his father, or some other ways. So if you lack historic records, and very often Megorashim or Eastern Sephardim do, there are certainly workarounds. So do you need a genealogist? I'm afraid, as a genealogist, the answer is no. And indeed, as somebody who loves this subject, I would encourage people to do their own research. Now, of course, some people just don't have the time. Some people might be living continents away from the archives they need to consult. Some people may not have the language skills, or just not very interested, and that is where a genealogist can be helpful. And so I will share my email on the screen, and if anybody does need any assistance, and I'm afraid this is a paid service, I can't provide, unfortunately, very much free advice, then please get in touch. Thanks.